My nephew moved into my spare bedroom on a Tuesday in March, and by Friday he was already telling me what I should do with my house. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I am 68 years old. I taught second grade for 31 years at Elmwood Elementary in Dayton, Ohio. I raised two children largely on my own after my husband Leonard passed from a heart attack in 2019. I filed my own taxes every year since 1981. I balanced our household budget through two recessions. And I once negotiated a contractor down $4,000 on a kitchen remodel by simply sitting quietly and waiting. I am not a woman who needs to be managed, but that is exactly what my nephew thought he was going to do. His name is Connor. He is 34, and he is the son of my younger brother who lives out in Scottsdale and calls me at Christmas and occasionally on my birthday if he remembers. Connor and I were never particularly close. He came to Leonard's funeral, which I appreciated. He sent a card when I had my hip replaced 2 years ago. Beyond that, we were the kind of family that likes each other well enough from a safe distance. So when Connor called me in February and said he had taken a new remote job and was looking to leave his apartment in Columbus, and would I mind terribly if he stayed with me for just a few months while he saved up for a down payment, I said yes. Of course I said yes. I had two spare bedrooms and a guest bathroom that hadn't seen a guest in over a year. He was family. That is what you do. He arrived with 3 boxes, 2 suitcases, and a very large monitor for his computer. And I made up the room with the blue quilt Leonard's mother had sewn, and I thought it would be fine. The first 2 weeks were fine. He was polite at dinner. He offered to take out the recycling. He asked about Leonard once, and I told him a little, and he nodded and said he was sorry, and I believed him. Then came that Friday evening. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. I was doing a crossword. Connor had his laptop open and was looking at something, and after a while he turned it toward me and said, almost casually, "Do you know what houses on this street are selling for right now?" I looked at the screen. He had pulled up a real estate site. He had already searched my address. I said I had a general idea, yes. He said, "Aunt Patrice, this house is worth $380,000, maybe more if you updated the bathrooms." I put my pen down. I looked at him. I said, "I know what my house is worth, Connor." He smiled the way people smile when they think they are being patient. He said, "I'm just thinking about your future. You're here alone. This is a lot of house for one person. And with what you'd get from a sale, you could move into one of those new senior communities. The nice ones. The ones with the activities and the dining room and everything taken care of." I picked my pen back up. I said, "I'm 68, not 92. He laughed a little. He said, "I'm just saying it makes financial sense. You could invest the proceeds, live comfortably. You wouldn't have to worry about the yard, the maintenance, any of it." I said, "I like my yard." He closed his laptop. He said, "Just think about it." I thought about it. I thought about it all night, actually, but not in the way he intended. Over the next few weeks, the suggestions became more frequent. He started mentioning specific communities. He showed me brochures. I don't know where he found them, but they appeared on the kitchen counter one morning as though they had simply materialized there. He talked about how the housing market was peaking and how waiting would only cost me money. He started using the word "we" when he talked about the house. We should get an estimate. We should think about timing. We should talk to a realtor. That word, "we," was the one that made something go very still and very clear inside me. This was not Connor's house. This was mine and Leonard's. We bought it in 1997 for $112,000. We painted every room ourselves. Leonard built the back deck with his own hands over 2 summers, and I still had a photograph of him kneeling on the board, squinting into the sun, holding a level. My daughter Sasha had learned to ride her bike on this driveway. My son Marcus had broken his arm falling out of the oak tree in the backyard, and I had held him in the car all the way to the emergency room, and that tree was still there. Connor had been in this house for 3 weeks, and he was already saying "we." I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice. I did not tell him what I was thinking, which was considerable. I just nodded and said I would think about it, and I let him talk, and I listened very carefully to everything he said, because there was something he did not know. 2 days after that first Friday conversation, I had called my attorney. Her name is Susan Park. I've used her for estate planning since Leonard passed, and she is one of those people who speaks to you directly and without softening anything unnecessarily, and I appreciate that enormously." I told her what was happening. I described the brochures on the counter, the real estate searches, the word "we." I told her I was not sure yet what Connor's actual plan was, but that I wanted to understand my options clearly before anything progressed further. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Patrice, let me ask you something. Has Connor ever mentioned being added to the deed?" I said he had not. "Not directly," she said. "Has he mentioned power of attorney?" I said he had mentioned once that I should think about getting my affairs in order. He had said it kindly, framed it as concern. Susan was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Here is what I want you to understand. Right now, you are entirely protected. This house is yours. Your will is current, and no one can do anything without your signature and your full legal consent. Connor cannot sell your house. He cannot move you anywhere. He has no legal standing whatsoever. None of what he has said to you carries any weight." I already knew most of this, but there is something different about hearing it stated plainly by a person whose job is to know these things. My shoulders, which I had not realized I was holding very tightly, dropped about 2 inches. Then Susan said, however, "Simply refusing to engage is one option, but it may not be your only one or your best one. Would you like to talk through some others?" I said yes. I said I had time. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes that afternoon. What Susan explained to me was this. My estate was already organized through a revocable living trust that Leonard and I had set up together after his diagnosis. The house was held in the trust. Upon my death, the assets were to be divided equally between Sasha and Marcus, with small specific bequests to a few others. This was all current and in order. But a revocable trust is called revocable for a reason. I could change it. I could change it whenever I wanted, for any reason, with no requirement to inform anyone of the changes. I sat with that for a moment. I said, what would happen if Connor escalated? If he tried to get me declared incompetent, for example, or pursued some kind of guardianship? Susan said he would need medical documentation and a court proceeding, and given that you are clearly competent, employed your full faculties throughout this conversation, and have an attorney who has spoken with you directly, any such attempt would be both difficult and expensive for him. She paused. And it would also tell us a great deal about his intentions. I said it already tells me quite a bit. She agreed. Before we hung up, she asked me one more thing. She said, "Patrice, is there anything you want to do differently going forward? How do you want to handle this?" I thought about Leonard. I thought about the deck he built and the photograph of him in the sun. I thought about Sasha's bike and Marcus's arm and the oak tree in the backyard. I said, I want him to think everything is going exactly as he planned, right up until the moment it isn't. Susan laughed. It was a good laugh. She said, "I can work with that." I did not avoid Connor after that. I did the opposite. I became easier to talk to, more agreeable, more open to suggestion. When he mentioned the senior communities, I asked questions. What amenities do they have? Is there a pool? I made notes on a little pad like I was genuinely considering it. I let him show me his real estate research. I said things like, "That's a good point, and I hadn't thought of it that way. And, you might be right about the timing." Connor began to relax. The suggestions came faster. He mentioned a specific realtor he had already spoken to, without asking me. And I said, "Oh, interesting. What did they say?" And I listened and I nodded and I wrote things on my little pad. In late April, he brought home a listing agreement. He set it on the kitchen table with the same casual confidence he'd used for the brochures. He said, "I just thought we could look it over together." No pressure. I picked it up. I read through it slowly. I said, "I need to think about this overnight." He said, "Of course, absolutely, no rush." The next morning I called Susan. She had already drafted an amendment to the trust. We had discussed it in one of our follow-up calls, and she had been ready for some time. I came into her office that afternoon. I read every page. I signed where she indicated. The amendment did two things. First, It added a provision that in the event the house was ever sold, the proceeds would flow directly into a separate protected account designated for my living expenses, healthcare, and travel, fully outside the reach of any other individual. Second, it named my daughter Sasha as successor trustee, replacing the previous arrangement, which had named Leonard's brother, who had since moved to Portugal and was not exactly accessible. Sasha did not know about any of this yet. I planned to tell her that weekend when she came up from Cincinnati for her cousin's shower. When I got home, Connor was on a call at his desk. I hung up my coat. I went to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of coffee and I sat by the window where the oak tree was visible, and I thought about nothing in particular, which was a very pleasant way to spend 20 minutes. On the first Saturday in May, Connor arranged for the realtor to come to the house. Her name was Janet Morse, and she shook my hand firmly and walked through the rooms making notes and told me, with apparent genuine enthusiasm, that the house would list beautifully with some minor staging. Connor stood slightly behind her and slightly ahead of me the entire time, physically positioning himself as though he were the decision-maker in this transaction. I noticed this. I said nothing. Janet sat down with us at the kitchen table and went through her comparative market analysis. She recommended listing at $395,000. She talked about the current buyer pool and interest rate conditions and how inventory in Dayton was low, which was favorable for sellers. I asked several thoughtful questions. I told her she had clearly done her homework. I said I was very close to making a decision. She said she was glad to hear it. She left a copy of the listing agreement for my review. Connor walked her to the door. I heard him tell her, in a lowered voice that was not quite low enough, that he thought we were very nearly there. He came back into the kitchen smiling. He sat down across from me. He said, "What do you think?" I said, "I think she's very professional." He said, "She is. And the number she's suggesting is right in line with what I've been saying all along." I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "So, are we ready to move forward?" I looked at him for a moment. I thought about everything. The brochures, the word "we," the realtor he contacted without telling me, the listing agreement that had appeared on my table like a foregone conclusion. I said, "You know what, Connor? I think I'm ready. Let's sign the agreement." He looked genuinely pleased. He reached across the table and patted my hand and said, "This is the right call, Aunt Patrice. I really think this is going to be good for you." I nodded. I picked up the pen. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in June at the title company's office downtown. Connor drove me. He was in a good mood. He talked about the buyers, a young couple with a toddler and another baby on the way, and said they had fallen in love with the yard, which, he noted with a particular kind of satisfaction, showed that the house really would be perfect for a growing family. I looked out the passenger window. The trees along Fifth Street were fully leafed out by then, that deep early summer green, and the light was coming through them in long soft pieces, and I thought about Leonard, and I thought about 31 years of second graders who were now in their 30s themselves, and I thought about how much I was looking forward to Portugal. Not to move there, just to visit. I had always meant to. We arrived at the title company. There was a conference room with a long table and a water pitcher and a tray of cookies that no one touched. The buyers were already there. A young woman in a yellow dress who looked nervous in the nicest possible way, and her husband who kept rearranging the pens on the table, and their realtor, and the title officer, whose name was Frank, and who had reading glasses on a cord around his neck. Frank opened the file. He explained the process. He began to go through the documents one by one, and Connor sat to my left and leaned forward slightly every time a paper was placed in front of me, reading along. We got to the disbursement of proceeds. Frank read through the instructions from the trust. He described where the funds from the sale would be transferred. Connor's posture changed. He went very still, the way a room goes still just before the power goes out. He looked at the document. He looked at Frank. He said, "I'm sorry, what account is that?" Frank looked at him over his reading glasses. He said, "The disbursement account designated in the trust amendment. The account held solely in Ms. Calloway's name for her benefit." Connor said, "What amendment?" Frank looked at me. I looked at Connor. I said I updated my trust in April. My attorney took care of it. The proceeds from this sale go into my account, my protected account, for my use. Connor's face did several things in a short period of time. He said, "You? When did you?" I didn't know anything about this. I said, "No, you didn't." He said, "But we talked about this. We planned this together. I thought the money was going to—" He stopped, because he had just heard himself say it out loud, and so had everyone else in the room. Frank cleared his throat gently. He asked me if I was ready to proceed. I said yes. I signed where he indicated. The young woman in the yellow dress signed where she indicated. Her husband stopped rearranging the pens. When it was over, Connor and I walked to the car together without speaking. He held the door open for me, from habit, I think, rather than anything intentional. We drove for several blocks before he said anything. He said, "I thought I was helping you." I looked at the road. I said, "I know you did." He said, "The plan was, I thought we were going to—" I said, "Connor, I know exactly what the plan was." He didn't say anything else. I watched the trees go past. It was a warm morning, and the windows were cracked, and the air coming in smelled like cut grass and someone's charcoal grill starting up somewhere nearby. I moved into my new apartment the following week. I want to be clear about this too, because I think it matters. I was not forced out. I chose this. The apartment is on the fourth floor of a building near the Dayton Art Institute, with a balcony that faces west and catches the evening light beautifully. It is 800 square feet, and it is mine. Not because I had no other choice, but because Leonard had been gone for 3 years and the big house had gotten quieter than I wanted. And I was ready to be somewhere that was entirely my own choice and no one else's. Sasha helped me move. She carried boxes and she hung pictures and she assembled a bookshelf on my living room floor while talking about her new job, and she stayed for dinner and we ate Thai takeout on the balcony and watched the light change over the rooftops. And it was one of the nicest evenings I had had in a long time. Connor is back in Columbus. He found an apartment. He called me once, about 6 weeks after the closing, to apologize. It was a somewhat complicated apology, the kind that is partly genuine and partly still working out what exactly went wrong. But I accepted it. He is family, he is young. People can be greedy and still be worth keeping. The young couple sent me a card after they moved in, a handwritten note on cream-colored paper saying how much they loved the house, how their little girl had already made friends with the neighbors, how they hoped I was doing well. I read it twice, and then I put it on my refrigerator. The oak tree is still there, in what is now their backyard. I hope it stays there for a long time. I hope their children climb it. I took that trip to Portugal in September. I went by myself, which Leonard would have found mildly alarming, and which I found unexpectedly freeing. I spent 4 days in Lisbon and 3 in the Alentejo, and one long afternoon at a small cafe near the water, where I ordered wine and read a novel and spoke to no one and needed nothing. I thought about the kitchen table back in Dayton and the little pad where I had made notes about senior communities I was never going to visit, and I smiled into my wine glass, and the afternoon went on in exactly the direction I chose. My account is full. My trust is intact. My successor trustee is my daughter, who calls me every Sunday and sometimes on Wednesdays for no reason, just to talk. I have a balcony that faces west. I am not a woman who needs to be managed. I never was. I've had a long time to think about what happened with Connor, and I keep coming back to one thing. Nothing he did to me was particularly original. It followed a pattern as old as any family story. Someone sees an opportunity in someone else's quietness, and they mistake that quietness for vacancy. They take the stillness for surrender, and then they build their whole plan on that wrong assumption, and the plan holds together just fine, right up until it doesn't. Connor was not, at his core, a monster. I want to be careful to say that. He was a young man with some debt and some ambition, and a relative who owned a house worth nearly $400,000, and who lived alone and who had, as far as he could tell, no one watching out for her. He saw a gap and he walked into it. That is a moral failure, yes, but it is also a very human one, and I understood it even while I was quietly making sure it would not work. What I think about more is my own part in it. Not any blame. I did nothing wrong, and I do not spend time punishing myself for other people's choices. What I mean is the part where I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be in response. I could have confronted Connor directly the first week. I could have told him to leave. I could have called my brother in Scottsdale and made it a family argument that would have echoed for years. All of those were options, and none of them were wrong exactly. But I chose something else. I chose to be patient and precise and very, very quiet. I chose to understand my situation fully before I acted. I called Susan before I said a single word to Connor about any of it. And I think that choice, that decision to know before I moved, is the part of this I am most glad about. There is something that happens when you stop reacting and start thinking. The situation does not change, but you change inside it. Connor's brochures on the counter stopped feeling like an insult and started feeling like information. His real estate searches stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like a problem I already knew how to solve. I was not powerless. I never had been. I had just needed to sit still long enough to remember that. Sasha asked me, the night we ate takeout on the balcony, whether I had been scared at any point. I had to think about that. I said, not scared exactly, more like watchful. Like you get when you've been a teacher long enough and you can tell from across the room that something is about to happen and you just wait and see which direction it goes before you decide what to do. She laughed. She said that sounded exactly like me. I think what I want to say at the end of all this is that the people who underestimate you are rarely paying close enough attention to be worth arguing with. You don't win by making noise. You win by knowing exactly what you have, exactly what you are entitled to, and exactly who to call on a Tuesday afternoon when someone has started saying we about something that belongs only to you. The rest tends to take care of itself.